Hey guys, welcome back to Worth the Spin. I am still your fill-in host, Jack, down here in my lavish studios. Today we're going to take a look at Beatles singles. We're going to look at the UK singles mainly. We're going to look at just the ones that were released in the UK that contained songs that were meant to be on those singles only and not on albums. They had more singles than this, but most of those singles are ones that those songs appeared on albums shortly after or right after the album came out. Something the Beatles were totally against, yet still happened due to the record company wanting something to put out there, usually around the Christmas season to help sales. Capitol came in and they said, hey, we'll take all those singles you don't want to put on albums and we'll chop them on brand new albums along with the songs we're cutting off of the other albums. For you who may not be familiar and may be more newer to the Beatles catalog, you had the core, you had the 12 British albums of the Beatles. And then in America, we had like 20 albums. You got more because in Britain, albums contain 14 songs. In America, they contain 10 to 11 songs. So when Capitol bought into the whole Beatle thing, they decided they were going to shave off songs to make it conform more to the US market of 10 songs per album. And then use those extra songs later on to make even more albums if the Beatles were a hit, which they were. So they saw dollar signs. So they shaved off 2 songs every album, and then they took all the singles so they can make even more albums. That's how you wind up with double your albums from a group in one country where you did not have that in another country. It's not that it's more new material. It's just they took advantage of the Beatles not wanting to gouge their fans buying the same songs more than once. So let's take a look at those singles and see what happened to them. We're going to start out with From Me to You, and this is backed with Thank You Girl. So from the period of 1962 to 1970, these 2 songs were not available on any UK album. But Capitol stepped in to help us out and put them on the Capitol album. We also have She Loves You and I'll Get You. Again, meant to be released as a single only and not to be included on any album. So of these 4 songs, up to the point of 1970, the Beatles did not release them on any album in the UK. Luckily, like I said, Capitol stepped in to help us get new albums that were really the same albums. So 3 of those 4 songs were released on the Beatles' second album. The only one that was not is From Me to You. The other 3 have all been released on this album. And From Me to You, for whatever reason, got left behind. It didn't get included on a US album. Note 2, I did not include the Beatles, a collection of Beatles oldies. That's an album that was released, released in 1966. The Beatles were totally against it. It was a greatest hits album. Parlophone wanted something for the Christmas holiday season. The Beatles had nothing planned. They said, we're going to slap this together. We'd like you to endorse it. They said, we will not do it. We do not sell the same songs to our fans. We have nothing to do with this album. They refused to take pictures for an album cover. They refused to promote it and refused to talk about it. To this day, the Beatles have nothing to do with a collection of Beatles oldies. It's not something you can buy in America unless you get it secondhand from somebody. You have to get it in the UK. And even in the UK when I was there, this was a pretty scarce album to find because this was made basically more for parents that were kind of getting into the Beatles music. So it was a way for them to catch up on the Beatles via a greatest hits album. Again, the Beatles want nothing to do with this, so that's the reason you never see this album re-released over here in America. And as long as they are in control or their children are in control, you won't see that happen. Next up, we have I Want to Hold Your Hand, and the flip side to this is This Boy. Again, up till 1970, you cannot obtain these 2 songs on any British Beatles album. But when Capitol released their first Beatles album, Meet the Beatles, they kindly put those two songs on here for us. Next up, we have one of the biggest hits in the 60s of the Beatles, I Feel Fine. And the flip side of this is She's a Woman. Up till 1970, you could not get these two songs on another Beatles album in the UK. Minus, I know some people will go, still on a collection of Beatles oldies. But the Beatles did not endorse that album. They don't include it in their catalog. So we're leaving it completely out of this list. Again, Capitol steps in with yet another new album of songs they mishmashed together to make an album that wasn't released in the UK. And they put those on Beatles 65 for us. And we have Ticket to Ride. Flip side of Ticket to Ride is Yes It Is. We also have Help. And the flip side to that is I'm Down. So, between 62 and 70, the Beatles did not release these four songs on, I take that back, 3 of these 4 songs on any album in the UK. Help did show up on the British version of the Help soundtrack, as well as the American version of the Beatles Help movie soundtrack. Differences in the two albums, in case you don't know. UK version. Straight opening, Help, I Need Somebody is how the song starts out. Side A, songs from the movie. Side B, new material by the Beatles. Capitol America wanted to get into, at the time, James Bond was really big, so they kind of wanted to get into that craze. Help had kind of a spy sort of type ish story kind of line to it. They wanted to get into so I don't remember exactly how it was explained. They wanted to toy with the James Bond thing to see if they can make it relatable to people that were into the James Bond movies. So they had a James Bondish opening to Help before the song actually starts. So the song is a little bit longer, a little bit different on the American version than it is on the British version. Also, the difference in these two albums is the first side is all the songs from the movie, whereas the B-side is instrumental music done by George Martin. The same way that Hard Day's Night was done. Hard Day's Night in America was A-side was the songs that were on the Hard Day's Night album. Flip side was incidental music done by George Martin. The British version, side A, is music from the movie. Side B was all new material. This is how you get double the albums in America that UK got. It's not that we got any new stuff that they weren't getting there. It's just we kind of copy paste it to make new albums. Next up, another huge single for the Beatles, We Can Work It Out. And the flip side of this is Day Tripper. So, between 62 and 70, these two songs were not available on any Beatles album in the UK. Yet, along comes another invented, made-up album by Capitol Records, Yesterday and Today. And they put Ticket to Ride on here. I mean, they put We Can Work It Out on here, yet Day Tripper was left off. Here's where it gets tricky. Next 3 Beatles singles to be released in 67. We have Hello Goodbye. Flip side is I Am the Walrus. All You Need Is Love. Flip side is Baby You're a Rich Man. And Strawberry Fields Forever. Flip side being Penny Lane. So, the Beatles would release EPs in the UK. some of these songs would appear on the EP. So technically, they did sell some of these songs twice. The EP was a big thing in Europe, for you who are not in the know. EPs were basically designed, let's say you couldn't afford to go and buy this whole album at one time because it was just more than you had collected from your allowance for the past couple of weeks or whatever. They were releasing EP, and EP had like 4 or 5 songs on it. So you would get part of what was on that album, but not all the songs that were on that album. So down the road, you still had to come up with the money to buy the album in order to get the rest of the songs. It was a pretty good system. So this is the original Magical Mystery Tour EP released in the UK by the Beatles. So, Baby You're a Rich Man was released on this EP. These other songs that were from these singles were released on. This was a good idea, and this is one that's highly praised by the Beatles. This new album, Magical Mystery Tour. So this contained Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields Forever, All You Need Is Love, Baby You're a Rich Man, Hello Goodbye, I Am the Walrus. All appeared on this album. This was the soundtrack to a TV show in Britain. For you who do not know, the Beatles released this EP to coincide with that television show. And it was basically the songs that were in the TV show. Capitol Records, trying to find out a way to release those songs just from that. They didn't have much to work with. And not wanting to do, or George Martin not wanting to be involved with doing any more instrumental stuff for another soundtrack album, decided, hey, we'll take those singles that have not been released on an album that came out around the same time. And honestly, they all, if you listen to the songs, they go as if they were meant to be on this album. And we will invent another new album, and on that album, technically it's not a new album. They use the same title for the EP, but that's an EP, whereas this was a full album. And they came up with Magical Mystery Tour, which of course was a huge hit. The Beatles loved the idea. Phone loved the idea in the UK. Eventually in the 70s, this was imported over to be included as an official title in the Beatles catalog. So this is probably one of the greatest marketing things that Capitol Records came up with. They invented an album that was not released in the UK, that the Beatles and the Beatles company loved, and used it as a new album to be incorporated into the Beatles catalog. If you go through the list of the Beatles albums, Magical Mystery Tour originally was not included in that list because, again, it was an EP. But after Capitol's success with this album, then in '76 they released it in the UK and included it into the Beatles catalog. So this is an official album in the Beatles catalog now, which is pretty neat. Alrighty, now we're up to a few more singles. See if you can stick with me here. We have The Ballad of John and Yoko, followed on the other side with Old Brown Shoe. We have Hey Jude, the first Beatles single to be on Apple Records. And the flip side of that is Revolution. Then we have Lady Madonna, flip side, The Inner Light. We also have Paperback Writer, flip side is Rain. These were between 1962 and 1970, were not released on a UK Beatles album. So towards the end of the Beatles' time, Capitol was trying to find ways to bring some of these other singles that were still just singles only and not on an album over to the US without releasing them just as singles. because they wanted to do the double dip. These were all singles in America, but they still wanted to put them on an album with more songs. So they came up with this idea. Hey Jude, or as is officially known, The Beatles Again. This is another one that was not originally released in the UK. So this album contains all of these singles. For you who might be going, well, Revolution's on the White Album. It's Revolution 1. It's same version. It's a slowed down version. It's the version that John originally wanted to release, but the rest of the band and George Martin thought it would be better to do a more fast tempo song than a slower song. So it was sped up, and that's the single that we got. So again, all those were released on this. This album was eventually released in the UK. But this is not considered to be a part of the Beatles' British catalog, only the US catalog. It's a lot of info. Now we're down to the last of the Beatles singles to be a single, but not meant to be on an album. That is Get Back. And the flip side of Get Back is one of my top favorite Beatles songs, Don't Let Me Down. Again, these were not released on a Beatles album. Wait. There is a footnote. So Get Back was released on both the British and American Let It Be albums. Difference is the version on the single is the full run out version. It's longer. It's the full song. Whereas what is on, I guess would be considered again a soundtrack album from the Let It Be movie, is a shorter version. And if you've seen that movie, and I'm sure everybody has, unless you're really more newer into the Beatles and just starting to learn some of this stuff, the Police broke up concert. The Beatles did their final performance as a band on a rooftop of Apple Records. Caused a little chaos on the streets below. Police were called. They showed up and they put a stop to the concert. So if you watch that movie, you can see as they're performing, all these police are showing up on the roof and they're talking to different people and they're saying, hey, you got to shut this down. You can't keep doing this. It's causing a lot of commotions. We need it to stop. And the Beatles got some sign to just end it, and they just ended the song. But if you get the single, again, the single has the full version, full finished studio version of Get Back. Another thing about this song and about this movie, Let It Be, the whole ideal, this is another concept album of Paul's, to see the Beatles. He thought it was an attempt. He thought it would help the Beatles bond together again and try to flesh out some of these issues with the band, and maybe they can work together as a band again. So it was see the Beatles perform, see the Beatles go into like the studio sort of and create an album, create new songs, watch them make those songs and turn them in from just ideals into real songs. And then at the end of this movie, the Beatles would perform for one final time in front of an audience. The Beatles lost interest in this. It became a huge mess. They couldn't perform the way they normally would with all these people in and out of this warehouse they were using. They couldn't get the sound right, couldn't get the equipment right, any of that kind of stuff. So they wound up just junking the idea and going into the studio to finish it up. By the time they finished it up, they lost interest in it and just kind of put it in a tin and said, we're done with it. Not really worried if it gets released or what happens with it. So this is an album that came out after the Beatles broke up. The cool thing here is, even though that ideal didn't work out that Paul wanted, not in full course, it did work. It did work with Get Back, one of the greatest Beatles songs ever. If you watch it, you'll see Paul just fooling around one day and he starts coming up with the melody for Get Back. It winds up getting turned into a song, and as you watch it into this movie, you'll see this playing around, this melody it comes up with, get turned into what Get Back is. So you actually got to see the Beatles do what they set out to do, create a song from scratch, and then perform that song. That is one of the most awesomest things that centers around Get Back. So even though that one was released on an album, again, that was released, after the Beatles broke up. But the single version is the full studio version, whereas the album, you get the short one that's from the film, where the police come to the roof and they cut the concert off. That's not all the Beatles singles. This is just the ones that have songs that were released and not meant to be on albums. And not quite a few of these, but some of these did not wind up on albums. Again, we had From Me to You did not wind up on an album. Up until 1970, didn't wind up on an album. Not the American or the UK. You Know My Name, Look at the Number, that didn't appear on anything. The Inner Light did not appear on any album whatsoever on either side of the ocean. And Yes It Is, and I think I'm Down. Neither one of those ever appeared on an American or a British album from the group's time of 62 to 70. After that, when we started doing the compilations and the greatest hits and things of that nature, we came up with ways to put those songs on there. And it's cool because if you're getting into the Beatles and you just want to buy the albums, you don't want all this cluttered EP and singles and albums and all these other things that to makes up the Beatles catalog, then you can just go and buy those reissues and anthology albums and whatever and get all those songs quite easily. Or you can do what most people do these days. You can just stream and download those songs. And I still get no enjoyment out of downloading a song in 3 seconds and then listening to it. Whereas I do of taking this, putting it on a turntable, and putting a needle on it. And that's mainly because I grew up in that culture. That's what we had. We didn't have digital downloads or digital anything. And if we wanted to listen to it, we bought it. If it wasn't new, we just went to record stores in our town or outside our town and scavenged around until we found it so that we could listen to it. So I love vinyl. Vinyl's awesome. I think it's the best way to listen to music. But that's my opinion. Again, I grew up on that, and younger people who've grown up on the digital downloads and things of that nature just don't have time for that. And I get it. It's different times, different taste, and that's okay. In the end, as long as you're listening to the Beatles in some format, you're all right by me. All right, that's all I have for you this week. Again, trying to keep with my schedule of a video on every week, preferably on Wednesdays. We'll see how that goes. Hope you all have a good day. Thanks for watching. I've lost my expensive graphics that I paid so much for, so we'll just use the cheapo manual. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Maybe subscribe. I hope you're getting something out of this. Somebody's watching it, so they're getting something out of it. So I hope you get something out of it. I hope you enjoy it. Don't comment in there if you want. Join me again next week. What we'll be talking about next week, that's kind of part of the surprise of waiting until next week. Thanks again. Be kind to everyone. There's too much unkindness out there. Enjoy your life. Enjoy it with music. I have a friend who tells me he's never listened to records or the radio or CDs. He hears songs occasionally and he just doesn't matter. Still, it just blows my mind. Life without music. Can you imagine that? That's incredible. That's incredible. Incredibly sad. I'm hoping to turn them. We'll see what happens. Again, have a good week. Be kind to one another. Please join me again next week for this, so I'm not just talking to myself. Thanks.